Hello and welcome to the Imagine Festival with me, William Crawley. And my guest today really needs no introduction. Noam Chomsky is an academic and author, a public intellectual, linguist, philosopher, historian, social critic, political activist. We could do 200 interviews in the next 45 minutes without actually retracing any of our steps. Noam, great to see you again. Welcome. Welcome to virtual Belfast. When people interview you, Noam, and I'm going to be doing this myself today, we tend to offer you the questions that interest us in the hope that you'll give us a bit of insight, and you always do. I was wondering if we could start differently. What are the questions that preoccupy your mind at the minute? What are you mostly thinking about?
Well, actually, I'm completely schizophrenic, have been all my life. So two parts of the brain. One of them is working on problems of language, cognitive science, philosophical questions. The other is concerned with affairs of the world, what's happening to this sad world, what must be done about it. So there's simultaneous questions on both sides. You don't want to hear about the first one.
I actually do. I'm very interested in your philosophical questions. I wonder if it's a complete bifurcation, or do they inform one another, those very abstract technical inquiries and the real world questions?
Well, they're kind of simultaneous. So one of them's going on in the back of my mind while I'm talking about something else.
What is the big question, do you think, in the real world aspect of your mind? Yeah, the big question of today.
Well, we are living at a unique moment of human history. There's never been anything like it. There will never be anything like it again. We're now facing the possibility of virtual extinction. That has never risen before. Several issues. One of them is heating of the climate. If we don't get this under control in another 10 or 20 years, we're basically finished. Okay, we'll get to irreversible tipping points. Doesn't mean that everybody's going to die tomorrow, but it means processes will be set in motion, which will lead to essentially the destruction of organized life on Earth and huge numbers of other species that we're destroying with abandon. We are destroying species now at a level that hasn't been seen for 65 million years. It's not just humans. It's insects, animals, plants, and so on. We can deal with it. The answers are known, but we don't have much time. The other problem is nuclear war. Very little talk about it. The dangers are increasing. They're very serious. Again, there are ways of handling it, but they have to be addressed. And they're barely even discussed. It's amazingly difficult to get people to pay attention to them. You take a look at the electoral extravaganzas in the United States, the party conferences, the conventions, all this Hollywood style stuff. Not a mention, barely a mention of the most severe problems that humanity's ever faced. It's nuclear war. Nobody even thought about it. Well, those are the major problems. There's plenty of others.
Plenty of others. And on that latter problem of nuclear war, Noam, I guess many people, or most people, don't realize the real danger of an accidental war, of a technological accidental war.
If you look at the record, it's a miracle that we've survived.
Yeah.
Time after time, an accidental error has taken place. We've come very close. Human intervention, often at the last minute, prevented it. We're now moving towards not only our Trump, of course, almost totally dismantled the arms control regime, greatly increasing the threat of nuclear war. The famous doomsday clock of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists was advanced towards midnight every year that Trump was in office. Finally, his last year, the analysts abandoned minutes, moved to seconds, 100 seconds to midnight. And fortunately, he wasn't, if he had been reelected, we might be finished. Literally, that's not a joke, both on global warming and nuclear war. Fortunately, there was just time within literally days for Biden to renew the New START treaty, which the Russians had been requesting. The United States had been putting it off with frivolous demands. So at least one piece of the arms control regime remains. On the other hand, new destructive weapons are being developed. There's the conflict is moving into space.
Yeah.
Both sides are, probably the Chinese too, are developing new weapons. And there's moves towards automating response systems, which is suicidal. I mean, as I say, it's human intervention that has repeatedly prevented errors which could lead to terminal war that were given by just mistakes in the automated systems. They're going to make mistakes. Doesn't matter how many supercomputers are doing the computation.
Yeah.
So all of this is, but on the other hand, there is a good side. The Treaty for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons went into force, UN treaty, last week. The nuclear states have refused to sign, but the fact that it's there is a basis for moving forward. And there are ways to move forward. One way, which is not pursued as seriously as it should be, is establishing nuclear weapons-free zones around the world. That's extremely important. For one thing, it does remove the threat from many areas, but it also has a moral impact. It's an expression of abhorrence of the weaponry that is capable of destroying us all. And that can be built on. And there should be discussion of this topic. There isn't, at least here. If you look around the world, there are nuclear weapons-free zones, almost. Every single one of them is barred either by the United States, sometimes with the support of Britain. Every one. Pacific zone, there's a Pacific nuclear weapons-free zone, can't be enacted because the US insists on keeping nuclear weapons facilities at its Pacific islands. The African one can't go into effect because Britain insists on violating the international law, the edicts of the decisions of the International Court of Justice, United Nations, which have demanded that Britain return the island of Diego Garcia to Mauritius, part of Africa. Britain refuses. They're servants of the United States, and they've expelled the population and offered the island as a military base for the United States, which is not symbolic. It's used for the bombing of Central Asia and the Middle East and so on. And Britain simply refuses these orders at the submitting itself to US power. It's a US vassal at this point. Will become even more so under Brexit. So that can't be, that African zone is still in limbo, can't be initiated. Of course, in the Western Hemisphere, the United States and Canada refused to join the Western Hemisphere nuclear weapons-free zone. The most important one in many ways is the Middle East. A very tense area, very volatile. What's considered now the major issue is the Iranian nuclear weapons programs.
Mm-hmm.
Biden so far is accepting Trump's position totally, that that Trump, of course, pulled out of the joint agreement, the JCPOA, happens to be in violation of Security Council orders, if anyone cares. But he pulled out, imposed very harsh sanctions. The Iranians are, after a while, didn't do anything. That now they're reacting by increasing their violations. It's now at the point where Iran is demanding, quite justly, that the United States return to the agreement. Trump, of course, refused, and Biden so far has refused. He's taken the Trump position that Iran has to move first, or we will harsh sanctions there. This is all leading to a point where it could blow up. The Israeli High Command has stated explicitly that they are planning direct military attacks to destroy Iranian facilities. They carry out assassinations and other crimes. Iran could react. They have easy ways of reacting. The center of global oil production is in northeast Saudi Arabia, right on the Iranian border, easily within missile range. They've already given signals that they could attack it. If they do, the lid is off. We don't know what. There's a very simple way of dealing with this. Establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. Why not do it? Everyone's in favor. Iran's in favor. Arab states in favor. Global South in favor. One veto, United States. Won't do it. The reason is very clear to everyone: does not want Israeli nuclear weapons to be inspected. In fact, the United States does not even recognize that Israel has nuclear weapons, for a simple reason. If it recognizes it, U.S. law comes into action, and arguably all military and economic aid to Israel is illegal under U.S. law because of its development of nuclear weapons, massive capacity, outside the framework of international agreements. Neither political party in the United States is willing to touch that. No commentators are willing to discuss it. It's under a veil of virtual silence outside the arms control regime. If here's a place where just breaking through to the public could have a major impact. A move toward establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone with ample verification, which we know works from the record of the last few years, that could dampen down one of the most severe problems of possible outbreak of major war. But it can't be discussed. An amazing example of how deep indoctrination works effectively in free societies, something that Orwell wrote about.
Can I ask you about two other areas where Joe Biden has echoed Donald Trump's previous policy? You've mentioned the Iran deal. I'll come to China in a second, but Saudi Arabia and that appalling murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And Joe Biden promised during the campaign that he was going to deal with this head on, and now he's pulled back from that.
Yes, he has. Reasons of state, the famous justification. His record on Saudi Arabia so far is somewhat mixed. He's refused to pursue the Khashoggi case, won't go after his MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. On the other hand, he has called for an end of U.S. participation in the murderous, destructive attack on Yemen, which is the UN has described as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. It's a total horror story. Obama poured arms to Saudi Arabia let them carry out the attack in the United Arab Emirates. Trump amplified it, and it compounded the atrocity by withdrawing aid from Yemen, humanitarian aid. Now, Biden has said that the United States will cease providing military aid to Saudi Arabia, but there's a proviso, except for defensive purposes. Nobody knows what that means. You know how the word defense can be distorted. So maybe it'll end that, maybe not. On China, what's needed in China, it's a very serious situation. There are provocations in the South China Sea. China has taken actions which are in violation of international law. The United States is sending in, leading, in fact, a major naval armada into the region, which is extremely dangerous. China might respond, in which case things can escalate. It's plainly a case where diplomacy and negotiations are needed. And there's plenty of room for them. Provocative military actions are not the answer. They're the way to lead. I mean, they may make you feel macho, but they're not the way to proceed in a dangerous, inflammatory situation where diplomacy is perfectly possible.
Is Joe Biden turning out to be a massive disappointment already to you?
Well, first of all, we have to recognize something. Biden is facing unanimous opposition from the Republican Party, which is no longer a political party. It has departed from parliamentary politics a long time ago. It's been called a radical insurgency, which is not exaggeration. You take a look at the stimulus bill, which just passed. Most of the Republicans are in favor of the measures in the stimulus bill. Their constituents are strongly in favor of it. It's needed. The country badly needs it. They voted 100% against it, 100%, just like the old Communist Party. You have an order from the Central Committee, everything just goes, and everything that Biden is going to try to do is going to have 100% opposition, almost everything. That means his hands are really tied on lots of things. There's a 50-50 split in the Senate. They can block anything. Now, the Senate is in the hands of Mitch McConnell, who is quite explicit about his intentions. In fact, during the Obama administration, the first 2 years when Obama had not only the presidency, but both houses of Congress, McConnell said straight out, our task is to make sure that the country is ungovernable. Okay, that's our task. We're wreckers until we get power back again, our only interest. I'm sure we'll have exactly the same thing now. He's in a better position now, 50% control of the Senate, can work together with Trump to make the country ungovernable so that they can come back in 2002 in the midterm elections in 2004 and to try to ensure this. The Republicans, which have a lot of control over the states, they, just because of demography, they have much more political control than numerical control. So they run the state legislatures and so on. And they're going full speed ahead to try to block voting. They know their only hope is to keep the wrong people from voting. There are literally hundreds of tentative legislations in process to try to block voting of minorities, Afro-Americans, poor people, and so on, who tend to vote Democratic. And a lot of this will probably succeed. That's about the only way they can hope to hold on to power. Now, McConnell and Trump are at each other's throats. They hate each other, and they're not but they do have one crucial goal in common: gain power. And the only way to gain power is to work together, which they will do. For McConnell, that means make sure that nothing can get through, no legislation can get through. For Trump, who owns the party? He owns the voting base. They worship him. It's a cult, make sure that they're going to be there to make sure that the Senate Republicans don't make a move towards doing anything that the country needs. And they take a look at the Republican leadership, they're trapped. After January 6th, the donor base, the big guys who own the country and run the party, said, that's enough. We've tolerated Trump so far because he's been lining our pockets. So we've been tolerating his antics. But January 6th is too much. And virtually unanimously, they told him to get lost. It was pretty striking. The Senate Republicans ran for the exits. You don't offend the donors. But they couldn't run too far, because when they get to the exits, there's Trump's raging mobs out there, and they're caught in between. You can see it with McConnell. One day he'll condemn Trump, the next day he'll talk about how much he loves him. They're stuck. That's the Democrats have their own internal problems between the donor-oriented, Wall Street-oriented, Clintonite neoliberals and the more progressive popular base, which is pressing for changes that the leadership doesn't want. So it's a complicated situation. It's not unlike continental Europe or Britain, for that matter.
Well, I was just going to bring you to this, because these are democratic challenges. But what about the rise of authoritarianism across Europe, South America, like Brazil, India with Modi, and various other parts of the world? We're in a very interesting moment, if I can use that term, in history, with the return, the wedge of authoritarianism is returning to politics across the world.
There are individual differences in the various countries, but there are some commonalities. A lot of this has to do simply with the neoliberal assault on much of the world in the past 40 years. It's harmed people seriously. So in the United States, for example, where it's been studied most carefully, rough estimates are that about $50 trillion have been essentially stolen from the working class and middle class to put into the pockets of the super rich. That's a Rand Corporation estimate, very respectable conservative organization. Their estimate is $47 trillion transferred from the lower 90% of the population to the top. That's not the top 10%, it's mostly a fraction of 1%. Things like that have been happening all over the world. Real wages have stagnated, inequality has soared, labor movement has been attacked, people have no defense. You travel through rural America, the base for Trump. You can see why people are angry. Houses are closed, stores are boarded up, manufacturing has been sent abroad under the neoliberal globalizations policies, which are great for financial institutions and for the profit of the owners of the corporations, but smash the working class. This is happening all over the country. In addition to that, there are ugly tendencies. Similar things in Europe, xenophobia and racism, they all come to the fore under conditions like this. Now, the authoritarian leaders, they rise because under such circumstances, there's fertile terrain for demagogues to come along and say, I'm your savior. Your problem is those bad guys out there. It's the immigrants, the refugees, the blacks, the elites, they're the ones who are at your throat. So I'm going to save you from them. And meanwhile, I stab you in the back with my other hand. That's the typical demagogue. Trump is a perfect example. One hand holds up a sign saying, I love you. The other hand stabs you in the back. Take a look at his whole legislative program. It's an attack, severe attack on the working class, the poor, the middle class, and the people who he says he loves and working for. But that's standard demagoguery. You see the same with Orban in Hungary. Modi in India is doing the same, appealing to Hindu ethno-religious nationalism. Bolsonaro's pulling the same trick and using the intense class hatred that's just virulent in Brazil. Striking to see the travel there. So there are differences, but there are similarities. And I think a lot traces back to the Thatcher-Reagan neoliberal assault, which has had extremely harsh effects everywhere.
When you add into all of that, and we've been talking about the climate crisis, about the possibility of nuclear conflict, even accidental nuclear conflict, the rise of artificial intelligence in the mix. We haven't talked about cyber, but that's in there too. The rise of authoritarianism, challenges to democracy around the world. All of this happening in the context where we are right now, Noam, of a global pandemic. And some people have thought of that pandemic as a kind of lens, a magnifying glass for many of the problems that we've seen in the world and in individual countries. Do you think this pandemic is likely to recalibrate some of the dynamics, some of the systems of power in the world?
Well, first of all, we should recognize that the pandemic will be overcome. This one, there are others coming, but it'll be overcome at tremendous cost and needless cost. But we know it's needless cost because there are countries that have controlled it by effective means. Variety of countries. It's not so. Asia and Oceania, New Zealand and Australia, and the Asian countries have by and large done quite well.
Well, I guess it's that quote, isn't it, where they say a virus is unavoidable, but a pandemic is a choice. A virus is unavoidable, but a pandemic is a choice, because how you manage a virus can determine whether or not you get a pandemic.
Yes, that's true. It could have been aborted in advance. It was known in 2003, after the SARS epidemic was contained. Scientists were very clear that other coronaviruses are very likely to cause epidemics. They can be controlled. They could have been working on vaccines. But here's a problem. The one problem is called capitalism. The drug companies have huge profits thanks to the highly protectionist neoliberal trade agreements, which are not free trade agreements. They give enormous protection to the big pharma, the huge media conglomerates, and so on. So they're super rich. It's one of the reasons drug prices are so high. But, and they have huge laboratories, great facilities, but they're governed by capitalist logic. You don't spend money on preventing a catastrophe that might happen 10 years from now. You spend money on making profit tomorrow. And so they're basically barred. They didn't do anything. The many states, like the United States, Britain, Switzerland, others, have wonderful national laboratories, very well equipped, great people working in them. Well, they were blocked too by the neoliberal hammer. Government is the problem, remember. They're not allowed to do anything. Everything has to be handed over to private enterprise. So the government labs didn't do things. So nobody did. Then there were many, then become individual differences, like the Obama administration, which was science-based, did set into operation a pandemic response system, a very extensive one based on scientific advice. The minute Trump got into office, his first days, dismantled the whole thing, totally dismantled it, started defunding the Central States Control, ended programs in which American scientists were working in China with Chinese colleagues to identify coronaviruses. Well, do that, then when it hits, you're in trouble. Then come all kind of missteps. But the point is, putting aside all that could have been done, when it hit in January, early January, China provided the world with the sequenced genomes. Virologists all over the world knew exactly what should be done. And some went to work right away. Right in Boston, where I lived, for example, the labs, hospital-nature labs, began right away working on vaccines to deal with it, and we're pretty successful. Others too. But you have to do things. So, for example, there was just a study in the United States on the city of Seattle in Washington, which instituted the kinds of programs that were carried out in Taiwan and New Zealand, China, Vietnam, and so on. The estimate is that if the United States had followed those programs, it would have saved 300,000 lives. It's not a small number.
No.
There are similar things elsewhere. It could have been dealt with. I mean, China, for example, has a very small number of deaths, a couple of probably fewer deaths totally than the United States in a day or two. Vietnam had almost no deaths. Taiwan, almost none. New Zealand had it very much under control. Countries, Senegal in Africa, had it under control. There are things that could have been done. It's not authoritarianism. It's mixed. New Zealand and Taiwan are no more authoritarian than the United States and Britain, less so, in fact. But they handled it. And
well, you had a couple of problems in the United States, didn't you, with some people? You've got a lot of conspiracy issues now in the United States, don't you? Conspiracies about science, about everything, really, it seems. They're wrapped up with QAnon, they're wrapped up with some of the Trump movement as well and around this virus, and also a resistance to the idea that the state should do anything to restrict my personal freedom. And some of the countries you're mentioning, they're not dealing with that kind of resistance to the state having that sort of role, are they?
And the same is true of Seattle versus Texas.
Yeah.
There's a sense of collective responsibility and cooperative action. If you look around the world, I think that's the major factor that made the difference. You could see it in continental Europe. About a year ago, the continent had the virus pretty much under control. But then Europeans decided, I want to take my vacation. Bothered. So they went to the beach and so on.
Yeah.
To get a big spike. Okay. That's what happens. If there's no spirit of collective responsibility, mutual support, a willingness to put aside immediate personal gain for the common good, if you don't have that, you're in trouble. And it's exaggerated in the United States by this so-called libertarian, actually highly authoritarian ideas of I can't be bothered. We're driven by personal greed, Ayn Rand nonsense. It's the core of the libertarian doctrines. Same with Thatcher and Reagan. Just be for yourself. Do what's best for yourself. Don't let anybody bother you. Which of course means deep authoritarianism. It means there's control by totalitarian institutions which have enormous power. That's what the great mega corporations are. It leads towards monopolization, transferring control into the hands of private power, which is pure totalitarian. Within a corporation, orders come from the top down, and nobody asks a question. You follow orders. And if that controls the government, you get the same thing. So it's called libertarian, but it's in fact deeply authoritarian. Now, on the individual level, if you think of a person says, I don't want anyone to make me wear a mask, that's very much like saying, I want to be able to run around shooting my assault rifle freely. I mean, if you don't want to wear a mask, fine, stay home. Don't infect others, okay? You're free to stay home if you want. If you have your rifle beside you, you're free to stay home with it and look at it, but not to run around shooting with it. That has nothing to do with freedom. And that has nothing to do with nobody impinging on your rights. And the anti-science mentality is very serious. A lot of it has religious roots. It goes way back in many places, but in the United States, it's extreme. Remember, the United States is the place of the Scopes trial, disbelief in evolution, and so on. Very large part of the population is not only Christian, but evangelical Christian. That incidentally includes the former Vice President and Secretary of State, both dedicated evangelical Christians. The Secretary of State, Pompeo, went so far as to say that Trump was sent by God to Earth to protect Israel from Iran, and people didn't laugh. That's the Secretary of State. The Vice President is comparable, and it's all over the country. Now, if you're a dedicated evangelical Christian, science is a very severe threat because it threatens your whole worldview. It tells you the world wasn't created 6,000 years ago, and many other things, and that's hard to deal with. So a lot of the anti-science attitudes are there, but it's not just in the United States. Take a look at France, a secular, pretty much educated country. Very high percentage of the population is refusing to take vaccines. They don't trust those pointy-headed scientists. This is a worldwide disease. It's very serious. The level of education and understanding is nowhere near where it ought to be.
Some of this takes us to the general assault, the popular assault on truth, doesn't it? Evidence. I mean, you want to have an evidence-based view of the world. That's one of the ambitions of science. And yet we have, even with the best fact-checking, the best truth-checking, we have this proliferation of falsity, of manipulation, of mistruth across our politics in the Western world.
And there's a lot of reason to be distrustful. I mean, it's true. There's a lot of efforts at manipulation, at thought control, at indoctrination, at misinterpretation, misleading, and people see it, and it leads to distrust. So take science. You don't take the opinion of scientists as gospel truth. It makes sense to have a certain degree of skepticism, a certain degree. Yes, you should keep an open mind, think about alternatives, and be open to counter arguments and so on. But when the weight of evidence is overwhelming, it doesn't make any sense to say, I just don't like it because my preacher says so, or I just distrust it because I trust myself. That doesn't make sense.
Can I bring two of these thoughts together, though? If you are defending restrictions on our personal freedom for the common good, in terms of mask wearing or lockdowns or other kinds of limitations, mitigation systems, would you also defend limitations on freedom of speech for the common good?
That's a different matter. I think that's moving into very dangerous territory. I think we should be very reluctant to impose conditions on freedom of speech. I mean, my own view, which I've expressed often, is that I think the United States, probably alone in the world, reached a reasonable standard on freedom of speech in the Supreme Court decisions of the 1960s. A lot of this was under the impact of the civil rights movement and the activism of the 60s. but the court did move to a standard which I think makes sense. It's fully expressed vaguely, of course, like all court decisions, but the general principle in Brandenburg v. Ohio, which basically held that speech should be free up to the point of participation in imminent criminal acts. So, for example, if you and I go into a store with the intent of robbing it, and I hold up a gun and say, open the cash register, or I'll shoot, that's not free speech. Okay. Now, there's no sharp line. The law can't draw sharp lines. Life's too complex. But it's a general principle that can be a guideline. So take the case of kicking Trump off Twitter. I think you could make an argument for it during his last days in office, because he was openly, unabashedly trying to call for a coup that would overthrow the elected government. And he was speaking to raging mobs who were willing to do it. Okay, that's participation in imminent criminal action. But I don't think he should be banned after that. That's what he says is awful, what plenty of other people say is awful, but I don't think we have a right to ban it. So that's territory that one of the areas I think where I approve of the general conception in the United States as compared with other countries. I think it's very dangerous to move into those restrictions.
Yeah, well, and as you know, in many European countries, we have hate crime legislation or hate speech, which falls far below that kind of bar that you're setting. That takes us to cancel culture. And you've contributed to this question and to this debate by expressing your concerns about cancel culture. Many other people, of course, Noam, say this is a fabrication. Cancel culture really just means consequence culture. When someone says something racist or deeply unpleasant or nasty, and they pay a consequence in their own life, perhaps their employer says, I don't want you working for me anymore with those statements, that's a consequence rather than cancellation.
How about people who say, I'm opposed to the Iraq War? The majority of the population in the United States thought they should be silenced. Okay, should they be silenced? How about people who, don't forget that cancel culture is nothing new. It's constant. It's used against the left all the time. I could give you plenty of examples from my own experience. Invitations withdrawn, meetings broken up violently, publishers put out of business to prevent them from publishing something of mine, time after time. And others whose experience is much worse. That's cancel culture. Open the door, that's what you're going to get. Okay. Yes, people who say make racist comments should face consequences. They should face condemnation, denunciation, exposure, but not being silenced. You don't want the state to have, or anyone to have the power to silence speech that they don't like. And we see where this leads. Take France, which has hate laws. They have a law, the Creusot law, which makes it a crime to question the judgments of the holy state on what's an atrocity. If the state asserts this is an atrocity, you're not allowed to question it. Stalin would have loved it. It's a perfect Stalinist law, and it is used to silence people. Maybe people whose views are terrible, but who cares? You don't want the state to have that power. If you give the state that power, we know exactly where it's going to go. And it's wrong in principle, and it's tactically wrong. The left is making a bad mistake by trying to join into this game.
I've got two more questions for you, and I really appreciate your time because you're very generous with your time. One is about America and Ireland, or Northern Ireland, And we know this week that the British government, the Northern Ireland office here, is sending a representative to try to build a better relationship between the Biden administration and the UK government. And we also know there are campaign groups obviously trying to exert leverage on the US government to put some leverage on the British government on the question of a border poll, a referendum on Irish unity here. What do you think the Biden administration, which role do you think it wants to have in respect of all those Ireland questions?
Well, frankly, I think this ranks pretty low in their priorities. They haven't, as far as I know, even given a hint about it. I presume that their main priority when it comes to attending to this issue will be to maintain close relations with Britain or whatever is left of Britain after the effects of Brexit take place. After all, Britain may break up. But I think that Britain remains a major U.S. They call it ally, really client, a major U.S. client. And the example of Diego Garcia, which I gave, is not untypical. Britain is in essentially a client relationship. The British understood this after the Second World War. They didn't like it. But if you go back to the Foreign Office records in the late 40s, they understood what was happening. Before the Second World War, the United States, Britain had been basically the dominant international power, not in will, but in global reach and activism and so on. Britain barely survived the war. The United States, which had not been a major actor before, ran the world. It had a position of power with no precedent in human history. Had maybe almost half the total wealth of the world. It gained enormously during the war. Manufacturing production quadrupled during the war while the other industrial powers were smashed. The United States had incomparable security, controlled the whole Western Hemisphere, controlled the oceans, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans. They conjured up a Russian threat, but it was mostly fakery to keep the population in line. And the British Foreign Office knew it. You read the records, they said, we don't like it, but we're consigned to be a junior partner of the United States. The United States, they said, is, I wish I could remember the exact words, they're pretty telling. They say, the US government says, here's what the world wants. Here's what it's going to get. And you're going to get it whether you want it or not. I said, that's Washington. And we have no choice but to obey. And pretty much they've obeyed since. And I think Biden will want to maintain that relationship.
Whilst also maintaining a relationship with his emotional homeland of Ireland. And he has stated that he strongly supports the Good Friday Agreement and he won't support a trade deal if the UK government does anything to budge on the border question here.
I think it's unpredictable. Yes, there's an emotional connection. There's also a huge Irish population in the United States. It's a major bloc. The Irish became officially white about a century ago. Before that, if you were in Boston, you could see restaurants with signs saying no dogs are Irish. They didn't quite make it, but they finally made it into the mainstream, became pure white. It's one of the ways in which racism is overcome in the United States. So yes, they're a major bloc. So I think there'll be a split, but so far at least, I don't see any indication that's even on the radar screen.
Final question, Noam. Much of what we've been talking about and your descriptions of our world, it would have to be said, some of it's pretty dark, some of it's pretty pessimistic, and maybe rightly so, appropriately so. What gives you optimism about our world today?
Well, I think there are many very positive signs. One positive sign is that for every one of the problems we face, the existential ones, the very serious ones, there are answers. There are feasible answers. The climate crisis could be dealt with an expenditure of maybe 2 to 3% of GDP. It's big, but it's by no means out of reach. And the means are available. The nuclear war crisis, we know exactly how to deal with. The Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is there. It's a goal. We can move towards it in steps like the ones we were discussing. Nuclear weapons-free zones can spread. The pandemic problem, basically it's known how to deal with. The basic science is available with the proper international cooperation and commitment to get to something like a universal vaccine for coronaviruses. It's not out of sight. Can be done, but it's not going to be done if you just leave it to private enterprise. Why should they bother? In fact, they make money from sick people, but it can be done. Vaccine. There's a terrible crisis right now that can be overcome. The rich countries are monopolizing the vaccines. They're not going to Africa, poor people in Latin America. China's doing something, India's doing something, a little from others, but not much. That's not only deeply immoral, but it's also suicidal, and it's known to be suicidal. It's interesting, perfectly well known. You don't give vaccines to Africa, the virus is going to mutates rapidly. You'll get new forms. You won't be able to deal with them. They'll spread to the West. You'll be done for. But the greed is so powerful that it overcomes even the instinct for survival. It's an amazing phenomenon in the West. Moral problem. But the point is, all of these things can be dealt with. That's a reason for optimism. Second reason for optimism is there's plenty of people dedicated to doing something about it. They're mostly young. When Greta Thunberg stands up at the Davos meeting and says, "You have betrayed us," she's right. Our generation has betrayed the young people of the world, and they're rising. Things like Extinction Rebellion, Sunrise Movement in the United States, the global strike. In fact, you take a look at the January 6th coup. Take a look at the people there. How many young people did you see? None.
Yeah.
It's quite typical in such actions for there to be young people all over the place. There weren't. Even Republican young people, they don't want this. They want a different world. Well, that's very encouraging. And we should recognize the betrayal and give them all the support that's possible. Can be done, should be done. So I think there are plenty of reasons for optimism.
Noam, have you had the vaccine yet?
I had one. I'm getting another one tomorrow.
Great.
But my wife, Valeria, hasn't even been able to get an appointment.
Oh, wow.
I'm 92, so I'm pretty high on the priority list.
If you were living here, we would have gotten you done a long time ago. It's been lovely talking to you. Always a pleasure, Noam. Thank you so much on behalf of everyone in the Imagine Festival. Noam Chomsky.
Hope it'll be in person pretty soon.
Me too.